You notice the compliment doesn't land the way it should. Someone tells you you're empathetic, insightful, good at reading rooms, and the words sit there like objects you're supposed to pick up but don't want to touch. Not because you doubt them, but because the recognition feels like being seen through glass you didn't realize was transparent. What unsettles you isn't the praise itself, but the sudden awareness that others have been watching a process you thought was private. The machinery of your attention, which operates below the threshold of your own observation most of the time, has apparently been visible all along. You've been performing competence in a domain you didn't know you'd entered, and now you're expected to acknowledge it as skill rather than reflex. The disorientation comes from this: you cannot remember deciding to notice what you notice, yet you're being credited with intention. There's a moment in most conversations where you feel the other person's narrative buckle slightly, a barely perceptible shift in tone or pace that signals something beneath the surface is misaligned. You've learned not to address it directly because doing so creates a different problem, one where your observation becomes the subject, and the original discomfort gets buried under explanations of why you thought you saw what you saw. So you adjust instead. A question angled differently, a pause placed where it redirects energy. The conversation continues, and the buckle smooths out, and no one notices the adjustment occurred, least of all you in the moment. It's only later, replaying it, that you recognize what you did. This is the gap that others call emotional intelligence, but that you experience as a tax on linear communication, an additional processing layer that runs parallel to the actual content being discussed. You are always listening to two conversations. The standard explanations for this capacity don't satisfy. People say you're naturally intuitive, as if intuition were a simple inheritance rather than a structure built from thousands of micro-observations your conscious mind didn't catalog. They say you care about people, which is true but incomplete, because caring doesn't automatically generate the specific cognitive patterns that allow you to track emotional states across shifting contexts. They say you're sensitive, which is closer but still misses the operational aspect, the way this sensitivity functions as both radar and liability. What they don't say, because it sounds less flattering, is that you became fluent in subtext because direct text was insufficient or unreliable at some point in your formation. You learned to read what wasn't said because what was said often contradicted the emotional weather of the room, and surviving required reconciling the discrepancy. The skill is real. The origin is rarely inspirational. After enough repetitions, you begin to notice patterns not just in others but in your own responses to others. You see that you perform a particular kind of emotional labor in group settings, absorbing tension and redistributing it as something more manageable, less volatile. You do this without announcing it, sometimes without fully realizing it, until you're alone afterward and exhausted in a way that has no clear external cause. The exhaustion is the evidence. It accumulates in inverse proportion to how much you had to suppress or smooth or reinterpret during the interaction. What appears to an observer as social grace is, from the inside, a sustained act of translation. You are converting incompatible emotional languages in real time, holding contradictions in suspension long enough for others to save face or avoid confrontation, or continue believing in a version of the interaction that's simpler than what's actually occurring. You become fluent in this because the alternative is friction, and friction has consequences you've learned to calculate. Faster than most people notice the equation exists. The inversion happens quietly. You realize that the very capacity that allows you to navigate complex social dynamics also prevents you from fully inhabiting them. Because you're tracking patterns, you're never entirely inside the experience. There's always a part of you watching from a small distance, noting who's uncomfortable, who's performing, who's about to escalate, who needs reassurance they haven't asked for. This observational layer, which makes you effective in certain contexts, also ensures you remain partially exterior to the moment itself. You are present, but not absorbed. Engaged, but not dissolved. The thing that makes you good at reading rooms also guarantees you never completely belong in them, because belonging requires a kind of unself-conscious immersion you can't access without shutting down the system that defines how you interact. You cannot both monitor the emotional field and surrender to it. The choice was made long ago, probably before you had language for it, and now it's structural. The costs are not dramatic. No one will feel sorry for you. You are not suffering in any way that grants you moral authority or narrative sympathy. What you experience instead is a chronic low-grade isolation that has no clear remedy because it's built into the method of connection itself. You can describe what someone is feeling with uncomfortable accuracy, anticipate their needs, Adjust your presentation to make them comfortable and still feel fundamentally alone in the interaction because you're operating on a different cognitive level than they are. They're having the conversation. You're having the conversation and also managing the infrastructure that allows the conversation to continue. This is not virtue. It's also not damage, exactly. It's an adaptation that worked once and then calcified into identity. And now you're stuck with the benefits and the penalties as a single package. You can see more than most people, which sounds like an advantage until you realize that seeing more also means carrying more, and no one's going to carry it for you because they don't see it in the first place. What you do have, if you're honest, is a particular kind of maneuverability. In conflicts, negotiations, or delicate social situations, you can read the terrain faster and adjust your position with more precision than people who are simply reacting to surface content. You know when to speak and when silence will do more work. You know when someone needs validation versus when they need contradiction. You can de-escalate without appearing to try, redirect without being obvious, create space for someone to save face while still steering the outcome. This is strategic capacity, not kindness, though it often wears the appearance of kindness because that's more socially acceptable. The advantage is real, but it's also narrow. It makes you useful in specific contexts and alienating in others, particularly with people who resent being managed even when the management is gentle and ostensibly in their favor. Some people can feel the calculation underneath the warmth, and once they feel it, they don't trust you the same way. You become the person who's too smooth, too aware, too controlled. They're not wrong. The social consequences accumulate slowly. You end up in a strange position where you're frequently consulted but rarely confided in at the deepest level because people sense, correctly, that you're analyzing even as you're empathizing. You become the one others come to for perspective on their relationships, their conflicts, their confusion. But you notice they don't often ask what's happening in your interior. Partly this is because you've become skilled at deflection, at turning conversations back toward the other person before they get too close to your own complexity. Partly it's because the role you've accepted, or been assigned, or created through repeated behavior doesn't include vulnerability in the way others perform it. You've become the observer, the translator, the stabilizer, and these functions require a certain detachment that makes mutual exposure difficult. People appreciate what you do for them without recognizing that the doing creates distance. You've optimized for being helpful and lost some portion of being known. Over time, this becomes identity rather than just behavior. You stop thinking of emotional attunement as something you do and start experiencing it as what you are, which means you can't turn it off without feeling like you're betraying some fundamental aspect of yourself. The awareness becomes continuous. You walk into a room and immediately register the emotional topology without deciding to. You meet someone and within minutes you've constructed a rough map of their insecurities, defenses, desires, wounds, not because you're trying to, but because that's how your attention is structured now. This is not a superpower. It's a condition. And like any condition, it shapes what's possible for you and what isn't. Certain kinds of relationships become difficult because you can't stop seeing the mechanics underneath the intimacy. Certain kinds of rest become inaccessible because your system doesn't fully power down around others. You've become very good at a particular way of being in the world, and that goodness has closed off other ways that might have been available if you'd developed differently. The resolution, such as it is, doesn't involve fixing or transcending or integrating the split. You don't overcome the distance between observation and participation. You don't suddenly learn to turn off the tracking system and become spontaneous in the way people who never developed this capacity are spontaneous. What happens instead, if you're fortunate or stubborn or simply tired enough, is you stop expecting the situation to be different than it is. You recognize that this is your wiring, that it has advantages and costs, and that trying to be something else is less productive than learning to operate within the constraints you've inherited or constructed. You become more selective about where you deploy the capacity, not because you've mastered it, but because you've accepted that it's expensive, and not every interaction is worth the expenditure. You let some conversations be clumsy. You let some people misunderstand you. You stop performing emotional facilitation in contexts where it isn't actually required, even though the impulse to smooth and manage and translate is still there. This isn't growth in the aspirational sense. It's more like acknowledging that the tool you've been using for everything is actually specialized, and using it constantly has worn you down in ways that aren't sustainable. You're still the person who sees the undercurrents. You've just stopped believing that seeing them obligates you to do anything about it every single time. The awareness remains, but the compulsion to act on it begins, slowly, to loosen.